The chill of dawn was a familiar ache in Kale's bones. It seeped through the threadbare wool of his tunic, a constant reminder of his place in the village of Oakhaven, on the outside looking in. From his perch in the gnarled branches of an old oak that overlooked the river, he watched the village stir to life. Smoke began to curl from the chimneys of the sturdy wooden houses, carrying the scent of baking bread and sizzling bacon he could only imagine. Below, the River Glynn tumbled over smooth, gray stones, its voice a constant murmur that was the village's heartbeat. It was both life and barrier, providing fish and fresh water while cleaving the village in two. The main settlement on one side, and the smaller farming pastures and the woods beyond on the other. Kale was a creature of the fringes, an orphan since the winter fever took his parents when he was 6. Now, at 16, he was a ghost in his own home, subsisting on the scraps of charity and the fruits of his own quiet foraging. He was lean and quick, with eyes that saw more than most because watching was his primary means of survival. He knew the blacksmith, Torvin, would leave a heel of bread on the anvil by mid-morning. He knew old Miva, whose hands were gnarled with age, would sometimes forget a potato or two in her basket. He knew which villagers had kind eyes and which ones would sooner kick him than offer a word. This morning, his stomach was a hollow pit, and the chill was sharper than usual. He watched the villagers begin their daily crossing of the Glynn. There was no bridge. The elders said the river spirits were fickle and would not abide one. Instead, a path of submerged, moss-slicked stones served as the crossing point. For the able-bodied, it was a practiced dance of balance and momentum. They moved with a casual confidence, their steps sure and swift as they headed for the fields or the forest. Then he saw her, Elara. She stood at the river's edge, hesitating. Kale knew her story, as everyone did. A childhood fall had left her with a permanent limp, her left leg dragging slightly behind her right. While others skipped across the stones, for Elara, the crossing was a slow, agonizing ordeal. She leaned heavily on a walking stick, her knuckles white. Her face, usually pale, was flushed with a mixture of effort and anxiety. A group of boisterous young men, their axes slung over their shoulders, splashed past her without a second glance, their laughter echoing over the water. A pair of women carrying empty baskets for foraging hurried by, their conversation never pausing. They didn't mean to be cruel. They were simply lost in their own lives, their own routines. Elara was an inconvenient slowness, a problem they had grown accustomed to ignoring. Kale watched her take the first tentative step onto a large, flat stone. Her stick wobbled on the slick surface. She tested it, retreated, then tried again. Her breath came in small, visible puffs in the cold air. A wave of something hot and unfamiliar washed over Kale. It wasn't pity. It was recognition. He knew what it felt like to be invisible, to be an obstacle in the flow of other people's lives. He knew the burning shame of struggling while the world moved on around you. Without a second thought, he slid down from his branch. His movements were silent, practiced. He landed softly on the damp earth and made his way to the riverbank, not directly toward her, but slightly downstream, as if he were merely there to wash his hands. He dipped them in the frigid water, the shock of it clearing his head. He glanced up, meeting her eyes for a brief moment. He saw fear in them, the fear of falling, of being swept into the fast-moving current. He walked over, his bare feet sure on the damp pebbles. He stopped beside her. "The middle stones are the worst," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "They gather the most moss." Elara flinched, surprised by his sudden presence. She clutched her stick tighter. "I know," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the treacherous path ahead. Kale didn't offer grand words or a sweeping gesture. He simply held out a hand. "I'll go first. Step where I step. I can steady your arm." She stared at his outstretched hand. It was calloused and smudged with dirt, but it was steady. Hesitation warred with desperation on her face. For a long moment, she said nothing, and Kale expected her to refuse, to let pride win. But then, with a small, shaky nod, she placed her hand in his. Her skin was cold, her grip surprisingly strong. He took the first step, testing the stone before looking back at her. "Here," he said softly. He guided her forward, his arm a firm anchor against her unsteadiness. Her walking stick became a third point of balance, tapping against the stone with a dull thud. They moved slowly, a stark contrast to the fluid grace of the other villagers. The water rushed around their ankles, a numbing cold that crept up their legs. Kale focused completely on the task, on the feel of the stones beneath his feet, on the slight tremor in Alara's arm. He didn't speak again. There was nothing to say. Their shared struggle was a language all its own. Midway across, her foot slipped. A small gasp escaped her lips and she lurched sideways. Kale's grip tightened instantly, his own body braced against the pull of her weight and the force of the current. For a heart-stopping second, they teetered on the edge of disaster. He held fast, his muscles straining, until she found her footing again. She looked at him, her eyes wide with fear and gratitude. He just gave a slight nod, his focus already back on the path ahead. Finally, their feet touched the muddy bank of the far side. Alara sagged against him for a moment, her entire body trembling with relief and exhaustion. She pulled her hand away slowly, leaning heavily on her stick. "Thank you," she breathed, her voice barely audible over the river. She didn't look at him directly, her eyes cast down, a faint blush on her cheeks. "It's nothing," Kale replied, and he meant it. To him, it was a simple act, a moment of shared humanity. He had seen a need and filled it. She looked up then, and for the first time, her eyes truly met his. In them, he saw not the village's pity, but simple, unvarnished gratitude. It was a warmth that spread through his chest, more potent than any fire or meal. She gave him a small, hesitant smile before turning and beginning her slow, limping journey toward the pastures. Kale watched her go until she was a small figure in the distance. He then turned and crossed the river again, the cold water no longer seeming so harsh. The act replayed in his mind, not as a heroic deed, but as a quiet connection in a life defined by disconnection. He felt a flicker of purpose, a sense that for a few minutes he had not been a ghost. He returned to the shadows of the village, finding a secluded spot behind the bakery where the warm air from the vents offered a small comfort. Curled into a ball, with the memory of that grateful smile warming him from the inside, Kale drifted into a deep and dreamless sleep, completely unaware that his simple, invisible act had been witnessed by the most unlikely of eyes. The dawn in Oakhaven was usually a quiet affair, a gentle transition announced by the first tentative chirps of sparrows and the lowing of cattle in the outlying fields. But this dawn was shattered. It was torn apart by a sound so alien to the village that it felt like a violation: the rhythmic, synchronized crunch of heavy boots on the frozen dirt road. Kale was jolted from a light, fitful sleep not by the sound itself, but by the silence that followed it. The birds had stopped singing. The distant animals were quiet. A heavy, expectant hush had fallen over the village, thick and suffocating. He lay still in his makeshift shelter behind the tannery, the familiar scent of curring hides suddenly feeling like a trap rather than a comfort. His heart began a low, anxious drum against his ribs. He crept to a crack in the warped wooden planks and peered out. What he saw made the breath catch in his throat. Lined up in the village square, as if they had materialized from the morning mist, were 30 men. They were not bandits or ragged drifters. They were warriors. They stood in two perfect, disciplined ranks, their posture rigid, their presence radiating a quiet, menacing authority. They wore dark, practical gear, thick wool coats over tough leather vests, and sturdy canvas trousers tucked into worn, durable boots. Across their backs, each man carried a hunting rifle, cleaned and maintained with obvious care. They were silent, their faces hard and unreadable as they scanned the shuttered windows of the surrounding homes. At their head stood a man who was clearly their leader. He was taller than the rest, with a stern face carved from granite. A thin, white scar cut diagonally across his left cheek, disappearing into a neatly trimmed gray beard. His eyes, the color of slate, missed nothing. They swept over the village, not with aggression, but with an unnerving, analytical patience. Fear, cold and sharp, trickled through Oakhaven. Old Man Hemlock, the town's self-appointed watchman, who was usually loudly directing traffic at this hour, had vanished. The baker, Martha, could be seen through her shop window, herding her two small children away from the glass. Silas, the blacksmith, stood frozen in the doorway of his smithy, a half-finished horseshoe clutched in his hand like a weapon. Every door was bolted, every curtain twitched. The entire village held its breath. Cale felt a primal urge to flee. Trouble on this scale was something to be avoided at all costs. His entire life had been a lesson in making himself small, in disappearing. He began to slowly, silently gather his meager belongings, a spare blanket, a small knife, the half-eaten loaf of bread he'd saved. The woods were his sanctuary. He could be gone in minutes, a ghost leaving a ghost town. The leader raised a hand, a simple gesture that nonetheless commanded absolute attention. He took 2 steps forward into the center of the square. When he spoke, his voice was not a shout, but a low, resonant baritone that carried with startling clarity in the still air. "People of Oakhaven," he began, his tone calm and measured. "My name is Boren. We are not here to bring you harm or to demand tribute. We are here on a peaceful errand." A few curtains twitched open a little wider. The collective tension eased, but only by a fraction. A peaceful errand did not usually require 30 armed men. "We are searching for someone," Boren continued, his gaze sweeping across the buildings. "Yesterday morning, at the River Glynn, a young woman was given aid. She was struggling to cross the stones, and a young man helped her to the other side. We wish to speak with that man." The silence that followed was of a different kind. It was a silence of pure, dumbfounded confusion. Villagers exchanged bewildered looks through their windows. The river. They had expected accusations of theft or demands for lodging. Not this. Whispers started like the rustling of dry leaves. "The river?" someone murmured from inside the inn. "Who does he mean?" "It must be Alara," another voice replied, hushed. "The Limping girl, she crosses every day. But who helped her? No one ever helps her." In his hiding spot, Cale froze. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin cold and clammy. Every muscle in his body went rigid. "They mean me." The realization hit him like a physical blow. The simple, quiet moment at the river, the one act of connection he had allowed himself in years, had been seen. And not just seen, but reported. To these men. His mind spiraled into panic. What had he done wrong? Had he offended her? Was this her family, come for retribution? He pictured the brief touch of his hand on her arm, the way he had held her steady. Had it been a transgression? In a world that had always punished him for simply existing, kindness was an unknown currency. He could only assume its price was pain. She described him as young, with dark hair, wearing a patched brown coat. Boren's voice cut through his terror. He asked for nothing in return. He simply ensured she was safe and then left. The description was painfully accurate. A few villagers who had seen Cale from a distance over the years, a fleeting shape at the edge of town, might recognize it. He was no longer invisible. He was a target. Boren turned to his men. His command was simple. "Find him." The warriors broke formation, not with a chaotic rush, but with chilling efficiency. They moved in pairs, beginning a methodical sweep of the village. They didn't kick in doors or shout threats. They knocked, spoke in low tones, their questions polite but firm. It was somehow more terrifying than open aggression. It was the calm, inexorable advance of a closing net. Cale's escape route was cut off. The woods were on the other side of the square. He was trapped. He sank back against the wall of the tannery, his heart hammering against his ribs so hard he thought it might break. The anonymity that had been his shield his entire life had been shattered by a single, simple act of kindness. The people of Oakhaven, who had spent years looking through him, were now being asked to look for him. And Cale knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it wouldn't take them long to find him. The silence that followed Boren's announcement was heavier than any stone in the riverbed. For a moment, the only sounds were the crackle of a baker's fire and the distant bleating of sheep. Cale's world, which had just been shattered by the warrior's arrival, now shrunk to the suffocating confines of the alleyway. He felt the phantom touch of 100 pairs of eyes, even though none had yet found him. Then the whispers began, a venomous tide rising through the crowd. "The river, yesterday," a woman muttered to her husband. The limping girl, wasn't that the stranger who passed through? And then, the inevitable conclusion passed from lip to ear like a contagion. The orphan, Cale. Cale's blood ran cold. He pressed himself flatter against the damp stone wall behind him, his ragged tunic catching on the rough surface. His invisibility, his only shield against the world's casual cruelty, had been stripped away. He was exposed, named, and hunted. Flight was impossible. The warriors blocked the main road, and the river at his back was a death trap he'd only dare cross for someone else. He watched as the villagers' fear of the warriors curdled into a new, more focused emotion, a morbid, hungry curiosity directed at him. They were no longer just scared. They were part of a drama, and he was its unwilling star. He saw old man Fitz, the tanner, a sour-faced man who chased him away from his yard more times than he could count, squinting into the morning gloom. Fitz's property bordered the river. He would have been mending his hides. He would have seen. Cale's heart sank as Fitz's eyes locked onto the mouth of the alley. A flicker of cruel recognition, of opportunity, lit the old man's face. He wanted to be important, to be the one who solved the mystery for these powerful men. With a theatrical flourish, Fitz raised a trembling, leather-stained hand and pointed directly at Cale's hiding spot. "There," he croaked, his voice cracking with self-importance. "In the alley, that's the boy. I saw him yesterday with the girl." Every head in the square swiveled. The collective gaze felt like a physical blow. There was no escape now. Two warriors, moving with the fluid grace of hunting cats, detached themselves from the main group. Their chainmail chinked a soft, rhythmic death knell as they approached. They didn't draw their swords or shout commands. They didn't need to. Their sheer presence was an unbreakable cage, closing in around him. Cale squeezed his eyes shut, a single, desperate prayer dying on his lips. He felt a firm hand on his shoulder, not rough but unyielding. He didn't struggle. The fight had drained out of him, replaced by a hollow resignation. They guided him out of the alley and into the full, unforgiving light of the village square. The walk to where Boren stood waiting was the longest of his life. The faces of the villagers swam before him, a gallery of expressions. Shock, pity, and for some, a grim satisfaction at seeing the outcast finally brought to heel. He was no longer the boy who lived in the cracks of their society. He was a spectacle. He was brought to a halt before the towering warrior leader. Cale couldn't bring himself to look up. He fixed his gaze on the intricate boar's head carved into the leather of Boren's chest plate, his body trembling as he braced for the strike he was sure would come. A blow, a kick, the cold steel of a dagger for having the audacity to touch someone so important. But the blow never landed. Instead, a deep, calm voice rumbled from above. "You are the one they call Cale?" Cale's throat was too tight to speak. He managed a jerky, terrified nod. "You helped a young woman at the River Glynn yesterday evening," Boren stated. It was not a question. It was a fact. Again, Cale could only nod, his mind screaming. What had he done? Had he insulted her? Had his touch been a transgression punishable by death? The crowd leaned in, straining to hear. Boren's next words dropped into the charged silence like stones into a still pond. "That young woman's name is Alara," he said, his voice resonating with authority. "She is the daughter of Chieftain Valerius of the Stonefall clan." A collective gasp rippled through the villagers. Chieftain Valerius was a name spoken with a mixture of fear and respect in Oakhaven. A powerful, stern leader from the formidable clan to the north. The idea that his daughter had been here, limping and alone, was unthinkable. Cale's head snapped up, his fear momentarily eclipsed by sheer, dumbfounded confusion. His eyes met Boren's for the first time. The warrior's gaze was intense, but it held no malice. It held appraisal. "We have not come to harm you, boy," Boren said, and to Cale's astonishment, the corner of the warrior's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but a softening of his granite features. "On the contrary, we have come to thank you." Thank him. The words didn't compute. Cale could only stare, his mouth hanging slightly open. The world had tilted violently on its axis. The executioner was offering him a handshake. Borin continued, his voice loud enough for the entire village to hear, a deliberate proclamation. Lady Alara was greatly moved by your selfless kindness. In a place where she expected to find no help, you offered it without question and without asking for reward. He took a step closer, his shadow falling over Kale. Chieftain Valerius does not let such acts go unnoticed. He believes that character is revealed not in battle, but in these quiet moments. Borin paused, letting the weight of his words sink in, transforming Kale from a criminal to a hero in the eyes of his stunned neighbors. He has sent us not merely with words of gratitude, Kale, Borin concluded, his voice dropping to a more personal, serious tone. He has sent us with a proposition, an offer that will require the same courage and compassion you showed at the river, an offer that will take you far from this village. The air in the village square grew thick and still, charged with the unspoken question hanging between the orphan and the warrior. Kale's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden silence. A proposition from a chieftain. The words made no sense, a language from a world so far removed from his own that he couldn't begin to comprehend it. He felt the weight of every eye in Oakhaven on him, their gazes a physical pressure. For years, he had perfected the art of being invisible, and now he was the center of a terrifying spectacle. Borin seemed to sense the boys' overwhelming panic. With a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture of his head, he dismissed the warriors closest to them, who stepped back to form a wider, more imposing circle, keeping the curious villagers at bay. He lowered his voice, though it lost none of its authority. "This is not a matter for the entire village," he said, his eyes fixed on Kale's. "But their witness is useful. They should see what honor kindness can bring." He took a half step closer. "My chieftain, Valerius, has a daughter, Alara, you know her." It wasn't a question. She is his only child, the light of his life. But she was born with a leg that did not form as it should. It has given her pain, but more than that, it has given her a spirit as hard as mountain stone. She is proud, fiercely so. Kale swallowed, the sound loud in his own ears. He remembered the determined set of Alara's jaw as she tested the first slippery stone in the river, the flash of frustration in her eyes. He had seen that pride firsthand. "She refuses help," Borin continued, his gaze softening with what looked like remembered frustration. "Especially from warriors. She feels we watch her with pity, that we see her as fragile. So she pushes herself, often to her own detriment. She will walk when she should rest. She will climb when she should not. And she will cross a swollen river alone rather than accept the hand of a guard she believes thinks her weak." Kale's mind spun. The entire, terrifying event was starting to coalesce into a shape he could almost understand. Alara hadn't told on him. She had reported on him. "Yesterday," Borin explained, "she returned to our camp, soaked and exhausted, but her spirit was different. She told her father of a boy who didn't rush at her with loud offers of help, who didn't grab her arm as if she were a sack of grain. She said you were quiet, that you watched, understood the struggle, and simply offered your strength without a word of pity. You walked at her pace. You let her find her own footing, offering your shoulder only as a support, not a crutch. You saw her, Kale, not just her limp." Kale stared, speechless. He had only done what felt right, what felt human. He hadn't known it was being analyzed, measured. "Chieftain Valerius has tried for years to find someone to be a companion for her, not a guard to command her, but an ally to walk beside her. Every warrior, every handmaiden has failed. They are either too servile, which she despises, or too overbearing, which she resists. But you showed a discretion and compassion that cannot be taught." Here it was, the precipice. Borin's voice was steady, his words deliberate, each one landing with the weight of a stone. "The chieftain's proposition is this. He offers you a place in his household. He offers you a warm bed, food in your belly, clothes on your back, and training and skills that will serve you. In return, your duty would be to Alara, to be her companion on her walks, to ensure there is a trusted presence nearby, someone she will not push away. This is not a task for a warrior's sword, but for a patient heart. He is asking you to continue the kindness you showed at the river, but as a formal part of his household. Kale's world tilted. A home, food, a purpose. The offer was a lifeline thrown into the dark, churning waters of his existence. But the lifeline was attached to a ship sailing for unknown seas, captained by a powerful chieftain he had never met, bound to a girl whose pride could shatter him. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the shock. He, Kale, the boy who slept in a drafty shed and lived on scraps, entrusted with the well-being of a chieftain's daughter. He glanced past Borin, his eyes sweeping over the villagers. The fear on their faces had been replaced by something far more complex. Old man Hemlock, who had kicked Kale away from his stall just last week, stood with his mouth agape, his expression a curdled mix of disbelief and raw envy. The baker's wife, who always shooed him away like a stray dog, was whispering furiously to her husband, her eyes wide. They were looking at him, truly looking at him for the first time, and they saw not the orphan, but a boy who had been offered a fortune beyond their comprehension. Their scorn had transformed into a bitter, grudging awe, and it felt just as isolating. His gaze drifted to the dilapidated shed behind the tannery, its rotten door hanging from a single leather hinge. He thought of the cold seeping up from the dirt floor, the gnawing hunger that was his constant companion, the profound, crushing loneliness of having no one. That was his life. Certain, bleak, unchanging. Then he thought of Alara. He remembered the brief, grateful warmth in her eyes when he had helped her to the other side of the river. He remembered the feeling in his own chest, not pity, but a shared understanding of being on the outside, of fighting a battle no one else could see. This new path was terrifying. He would surely fail. He was nobody. But the alternative, to remain here to be nobody forever, was a different kind of death. A slow one. He pulled his gaze back to Borin, the warrior's weathered face patient, expectant. Kale took a shaky breath, the first clean breath of a new life. He stood a little straighter, the decision solidifying in his gut, a small, hard kernel of courage. "I will," Kale said, his voice barely a whisper, but it carried across the silent square with the force of a shout. Borin's stern expression did not change, but a flicker of approval, of respect, ignited in his eyes. He nodded once, a gesture of finality. "Good," he said. "Gather what you have, we leave immediately." Kale turned and looked toward the shed one last time. He had nothing to gather. His past was an empty room. With a final glance at the stunned faces of the villagers, he turned his back on Oakhaven and took his first step toward the future. The moment Kale muttered his acceptance, the world seemed to lurch forward at a dizzying pace. There was no time for farewells, for he had no one to say goodbye to. The villagers of Oakhaven, who had been a silent, judgmental chorus to his life, now watched with a mixture of raw envy and disbelief. Their scorn had curdled into something far more complex, as they saw the boy they had dismissed as worthless being escorted away by a company of elite warriors. Kale kept his eyes fixed on the muddy path, feeling the weight of their stares like a physical pressure on his back. He clutched the straps of his threadbare satchel, the only possession he owned, containing a half-eaten loaf of stale bread and a small, smooth stone he'd once found by the river. It felt foolishly insignificant now. The warriors moved with an unnerving efficiency. They formed a protective diamond shape around him and Borin, their leather boots making a steady, rhythmic squelch in the damp earth as they left Oakhaven's shabby perimeter behind. The familiar scent of wood smoke and damp thatch faded, replaced by the clean, sharp smell of pine and wet leaves. For the first time, Kale was walking away from the only place he had ever known, and the emptiness of what he was leaving behind was a strange, hollow comfort. There were no fond memories to cling to, only the ghost of hunger and the sting of loneliness. For the first few hours, the journey was silent. Kale was a knot of anxiety, acutely aware of every rustle of the trees, every snap of a twig. These men were living weapons, their movements economical and precise. They didn't speak, communicating with hand signals and subtle shifts in posture. Kale, used to the clumsy chaos of the village, felt like a sparrow caught in a flock of hawks. He expected harsh words or a rough shove, but received neither. He was simply an object they were transporting, and their professional indifference was almost more unnerving than open hostility. As the sun climbed higher, casting dappled light through the dense canopy of the forest, Boren slowed his pace to match Kale's. The warrior's presence was immense, but his voice, when he finally spoke, was unexpectedly calm. "The first steps are the hardest, boy. Your world has just become much larger." Kale flinched, startled by the direct address. He could only manage a tight nod, his throat too dry for words. Boren seemed to understand. He gestured to the woods around them. "Our lands are not so different from these, but they are vaster. We are of the clan of the Stone Bear. We value strength, but we also value resilience. The kind a sapling shows when it grows in the crack of a boulder." He glanced at Kale, his gaze sharp and assessing. "Chieftain Valerius saw that in you, not the strength of an ox, but the endurance of stone." The comparison was so alien to Kale's perception of himself that he didn't know how to respond. He had never thought of himself as resilient, only as someone who had learned not to break because there was no one to pick up the pieces. They stopped midday to rest. One of the warriors handed Kale a water skin and a chunk of hard cheese with a piece of smoked meat. It was more food than Kale often saw in 3 days. He ate slowly, self-consciously, trying not to appear as starved as he was. The flavor was rich and salty, a world away from the bland, gritty gruel of his Oak Haven life. The simple meal felt like a pact, a first taste of the new life he had been promised. As they continued their trek, Boren began to speak more freely, his words painting a picture of the world Kale was entering. He spoke of Chieftain Valerius not as a terrifying warlord, but as a stern and deeply principled father. "Elara, she is his heart and his fury," Boren explained, his voice softening slightly. "She was born with a fire in her spirit. The limp, it came from a fall when she was a child, a foolish climb to prove she was as capable as the boys her age. The fall stole her speed, but it sharpened her pride into a weapon. She trusts no one because she feels they see only her weakness." Boren looked at Kale directly. "The chieftain doesn't need you to be her guard. He has 30 of me for that. He doesn't need you to be her servant. What he hopes is that you will be a mirror. You have known hardship. You do not offer pity because you have never received it. You offered her help across that river not because you saw a cripple, but because you saw another person struggling. That is a language Elara has not heard before. It may be the only one she is willing to learn." The weight of this expectation settled on Kale's shoulders, heavier than his satchel. It wasn't just about a roof and food. It was about reaching a girl who had walled herself off from the world. That evening, as they made camp, Boren tossed a bundle at Kale's feet. "You'll freeze in those rags. These are spares." Inside were a thick woolen tunic, sturdy trousers, and soft leather boots that had been well worn but were still in excellent condition. They were the color of moss and earth, the colors of the warriors. Changing out of his tattered clothes felt like shedding a skin. The new garments were warm and heavy, a shield against the evening chill. For the first time in his life, Kale felt solid. He was no longer the Oak Haven orphan. He was someone else, though he wasn't yet sure who. 2 days later, after traversing rolling hills that left Kale's legs aching and crossing plains under a vast, open sky that terrified and thrilled him in equal measure, Boren pointed toward the horizon. "There, our home, the fortress of Stonefall." Kale followed his gaze, and his breath caught. Nestled at the foot of a granite-faced mountain was a settlement far larger than Oak Haven could ever dream of being. It wasn't a castle of sharp spires, but a sprawling, formidable stronghold. A high, thick palisade of sharpened logs encircled dozens of buildings, their thatched and wooden-shingled roofs clustered together. In the center stood a great hall, its timbered frame massive and imposing, a plume of smoke rising from a stone chimney into the crisp morning air. Banners bearing the sigil of a snarling bear, etched in stone, fluttered from the main gate. The distant, rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoed across the valley, a steady heartbeat for the fortress. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming. Oak Haven was a handful of huts by a river. This was a bastion, a center of power, a place of purpose and might. The warriors straightened their shoulders, their pace quickening as they approached the gate. For them, it was a return home. For Kale, it was the edge of the world. He stood frozen for a moment, clutching the new fabric of his tunic. The boy who had helped a girl across a river felt very small. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at him again, but this time it was different. Mixed in with the terror was a spark of something else, something he hadn't felt before, a fragile, flickering sense of possibility. His journey with the warriors had ended, but his real trial was about to begin. The great stone gates of Stonefall groaned open, revealing not a quiet courtyard, but a small, self-contained town teeming with life. The air, crisp and tasting of pine from the surrounding forest, was thick with the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the shouts of men sparring in a muddy yard, and the scent of wood smoke and roasting meat. Servants bustled along stone pathways, their arms laden with laundry or supplies. For Kale, who had only known the sparse, quiet desperation of Oakhaven, it was an overwhelming sensory assault. Every person moved with a purpose he couldn't comprehend, part of a complex machine he was now supposed to fit into. Boren led him past the training yard, where shirtless warriors, their bodies gleaming with sweat despite the cool mountain air, swung heavy practice swords. They paused to nod respectfully at Boren, their eyes lingering on Kale with frank curiosity. Kale kept his gaze fixed on Boren's broad back, feeling like a field mouse dragged into a wolf's den. They entered the main keep, a hulking structure of dark, formidable stone. The air inside grew cooler, quieter, echoing with the soft scrape of their boots on the flagstone floors. They stopped before a set of massive oak doors, banded with black iron. Boren placed a hand on Kale's shoulder, his grip firm and grounding. "The chieftain is a hard man, but a fair one," he murmured, his voice low. "He sees more than he says. Do not try to be anything you are not. It is your quiet nature that brought you here. Remember that." With that, Boren pushed the doors open. The great hall was a cavern of stone and smoke. Enormous wooden beams, dark with age, supported a ceiling lost in shadow. A fire roared in a hearth large enough for a man to stand upright in, its flickering light dancing across furs and woven tapestries that depicted hunts and battles. At the center of it all, seated in a high-backed chair carved from a single, massive oak, was Chieftain Valerius. He was not as large as Boren, but he possessed an intensity that seemed to shrink everyone else in the room. His hair and beard were the color of salted iron, and his eyes, a piercing gray, were fixed on Kale the moment he stepped through the door. Boren led Kale to the foot of the low dais where the chieftain sat. "Chieftain Valerius," Boren announced, his voice booming in the hall. "I have brought the boy, Kale." Valerius did not speak immediately. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows on the arms of his throne, steepling his fingers. His gaze was unnervingly sharp, as if he were peeling back layers of Kale's life. The hunger, the loneliness, the cold nights spent in the abandoned shack. Kale felt a tremor of his old fear return, the instinct to make himself small and invisible. But Boren's words echoed in his mind. He straightened his shoulders, met the chieftain's gaze, and waited. So, Valerius's voice was like the grinding of stones, deep and resonant. "You are the one who helped my daughter." "I am," Kale said. His own voice sounded thin and reedy in the vast hall. "Why?" the chieftain asked, his question a blunt instrument. Kale paused, searching for the right words. "She needed help." Valerius grunted, a sound that could have been approval or dismissal. "Many people need help. Few receive it, especially from those who have little to give themselves. Boren tells me you asked for nothing. You did not even wait for a thank you. You simply helped her across the water and disappeared. That is unusual." He rose from his chair and descended the 2 steps of the dais, circling Kale slowly like a wolf inspecting its prey. "I did not summon you here for your strength, boy," he said, his voice closer now. "My warriors have strength. I did not bring you here for your wit. My advisors have wit. I brought you here for what you did when you believed no one of power was watching. You offered help, not pity. There is a profound difference. My daughter, she has known far too much of the latter." He stopped in front of Kale, close enough that Kale could see the lines of care and worry etched around his stern eyes. Alara is proud as any warrior in this keep. Her leg is a weakness she despises, and she despises anyone who reminds her of it. She will not be easy. She will test you. She will push you away with all her might, because she is terrified of letting anyone close enough to hurt her again. Just then, a heavy door at the side of the hall creaked open. Alara stood there, framed by the light of the corridor behind her. She moved into the hall with that familiar, deliberate gait, her jaw set and her chin held high, a mask of defiance firmly in place. Her eyes, the same piercing gray as her father's, swept the room and settled on Kale with a look of cold fire. It wasn't just anger. It was a profound, biting resentment, the fury of someone whose private struggles had been made a public spectacle. She stopped a dozen feet away, her gaze flickering between her father and Kale. "Is this him?" she asked, her voice sharp and clear, cutting through the hall's quiet hum. "The stray you've brought home?" Kale felt the sting of her words, but he also saw the defensiveness beneath them. He remembered her face at the river, the flash of gratitude before she hid it away. He gave a simple, respectful nod. "My lady." Her eyes narrowed, dismissing his gesture entirely. She turned her glare back to Valerius. "You parade my weakness before the entire clan, and now you bring a constant reminder of it into my own home. An orphan from a mud pit village to be what? My keeper. He is here to be a companion, Alara." "Nothing more," Valerius said, his tone firm but laced with an undeniable weariness. "His name is Kale." Alara gave Kale a slow, deliberate look, from his new boots to his still unruly hair. A small, cruel smile touched her lips. "I see. Another shadow to follow me around." Without another word, she turned with a sharp, almost violent motion and walked out, the sound of her uneven footsteps echoing long after the door had closed behind her. Silence descended upon the great hall, thick and uncomfortable. Kale stood frozen, the warmth of the fire doing nothing to chase away the chill of her reception. He had faced hunger, cold, and the scorn of an entire village, but the focused hostility in Alara's eyes was a different kind of trial. Valerius sighed, a long, heavy sound of paternal frustration. He looked at Kale, his expression unreadable. "A servant will show you to your quarters. You will eat with the household guard tonight. Rest." Borin was right. This will not be easy. A young woman appeared silently and beckoned for Kale to follow. He was led through a maze of corridors to a small room on the second floor. It was Spartan, containing only a simple wooden bed with a thick wool blanket, a small table, a chair, and a wash basin. But to Kale, it was a palace. It had a solid door that latched from the inside and a narrow, shuttered window. He walked to the window and opened it. It overlooked the training yard, and beyond it, the vast, dark expanse of the forest under a sky turning purple with twilight. For the first time in his life, he was safe, warm, and fed. And for the first time in his life, he had a purpose. It was a purpose wrapped in the resentment of a wounded, proud girl, but it was his. He closed the shutter, the reality of his new life settling upon him like the heavy wool blanket on the bed. The road ahead was steeper than any river he had ever crossed. The first dawn in Stonefall broke with a chilling clarity that Oakhaven's misty mornings never possessed. The air was thin and crisp, carrying the distant sounds of steel on steel from the training yard and the scent of hearth smoke. Kale ate a quiet breakfast of porridge and dried fruit in the great hall, seated at the end of a long table with the guards. He felt their curious glances, but no one spoke to him directly, granting him a space he didn't know he needed. His eyes, however, kept drifting to the high table, where Valerius sat with Borin, and to the empty chair beside the chieftain. After the meal, as the warriors dispersed to their duties, Kale found himself adrift in the stone corridors. He remembered Borin's words about Alara, about her fierce independence and the small world she had carved out for herself within the keep. He recalled a brief mention of a garden. Guided by a hunch, he followed a path that wound behind the main tower, leading to a small, sheltered courtyard. There it was, a patch of earth, protected by high stone walls, where stubborn mountain flowers and herbs fought for life. It was clear the garden was tended with care, but also with frustration. Weeds were encroaching on a bed of pale blue blossoms, their green tendrils choking the delicate stems. Kale looked around. No one was watching. He knelt on the cold ground and, with the patient, methodical hands of someone who knew what it was to be unwanted, began to pull the weeds. He worked for nearly an hour, his mind blissfully empty, focused only on the soil and the roots. He didn't hear her approach until her shadow fell over him. "What do you think you're doing?" Kale looked up. Alara stood there, her arms crossed, her face a mask of indignation. Her weight was shifted to her good leg, a posture of defiance he was beginning to recognize. He didn't flinch or stammer an excuse. He simply held up a handful of weeds. "They were strangling the flowers," he said, his voice even. "I thought they should have a chance to breathe." Her eyes narrowed, searching his for a hidden motive, pity, a desire to indebt her, a command from her father. She found none. She saw only a boy with dirt on his knees and a simple, unadorned truth in his gaze. She said nothing more, but she didn't tell him to leave. She turned and walked away, her limp slightly less pronounced, as if she were carrying a lighter burden. Kale returned to his work, a silent understanding passing between them. That small moment became the foundation of the weeks and months that followed. Kale never forced his presence on her. Instead, he built a life around the edges of hers. He learned the rhythm of stonefall. He spent his mornings in the training yard with Boren, who taught him not just the sword, but balance and footing, turning Kale's lean frame into one of wiry strength. His afternoons were often spent in the keep's library, a place Alara frequented. He would sit in a far corner, slowly tracing the words in a book on animal husbandry or local history, never speaking to her but sharing the quiet space. Sometimes he would see her watching him, a flicker of curiosity in her expression before she would look away. He became a fixture, a quiet constant. The guards grew to respect him for his work ethic and his lack of pretense. Valerius would watch him from his study, a rare, approving nod his only comment. Kale was no longer the Oakhaven orphan. He was becoming a man of Stonefall, defined not by his past, but by his patient dedication. The turning point came on a blustery afternoon as autumn threatened to turn to winter. Kale was crossing the main courtyard when he saw Alara speaking with the stable master. A few younger warriors, full of arrogance and mead from their midday meal, were nearby. One of them, a broad-shouldered youth named Jorn who had always viewed Kale with disdain, called out loudly, "Be careful where you step, my lady. A sudden gust might knock you right over." His friends snickered. Alara's back went rigid, her face flushing with a familiar, helpless anger. She ignored them, her dignity a fragile shield. Kale felt a cold fury rise within him, but it was not the hot, reckless anger of youth. It was something measured and strong. He changed his course and walked directly toward the warriors. He wasn't large, but his quiet intensity made them pause. He stopped in front of Jorn, his eyes level. "Her balance is truer than yours will ever be," Kale said, his voice low but carrying clearly in the wind. "She stands on her own strength. You stand on insults to feel tall. It must be a lonely view from down there." Jorn's face turned crimson. He clenched his fists, towering over Kale. "You're a brave stray for a chieftain's pet." "I am Kale," he replied, his voice unwavering, "and I am her companion. An insult to her is an insult to this keep and to the chieftain who trusts me. Is that a burden your shoulders are broad enough to carry?" He held Jorn's gaze, unblinking. The other warriors shifted uncomfortably. Kale hadn't raised his voice, hadn't drawn a weapon, but he had one. Defeated by a quiet dignity he couldn't comprehend, Jorn grunted and stalked away, his friends trailing behind him like smoke. Kale turned and saw Alara looking at him, her expression one of utter shock. For the first time, he saw past the pride and the pain. He saw the girl who had struggled at the river. He gave a slight, respectful nod and continued on his way, leaving her with the weight of his unexpected defense. That evening, he sought the quiet solitude of a small stream that ran through the gardens, its gurgling sound a soothing balm. It reminded him of the river Glynn, of the day his life had changed. He sat on a smooth, mossy stone, watching the water flow. "They have never seen me fight back," a soft voice said. Ilara was standing a few feet away, her hands clasped in front of her. The wind had softened, and the setting sun cast a golden light on the stone walls of the keep. "You shouldn't have to," Kale said simply, not looking at her. She took a hesitant step closer and sat on a nearby rock. "Why did you defend me, I mean? My father didn't order you to do that." "No," he agreed. "He didn't." He finally turned to face her. "In Oakhaven, everyone saw me as just one thing, the orphan. It was all I was. I think you know what that feels like, to be seen as just one thing." Her defensive posture finally melted away, replaced by a profound weariness. "The limp," she whispered. "Either they pity me or they mock me. They never just see me." "I see you," Kale said, and it was the most honest thing he had ever uttered. "I saw you at the river. You were determined, you were frustrated, you were fighting, you weren't your limp, you were Ilara." A single tear traced a path down her cheek, but she was smiling, a real, unguarded smile. "And you," she said, her voice finding its strength, "are not the orphan, you are Kale." A comfortable silence settled between them, deeper and more meaningful than any conversation. From a high window in the keep, Valerius stood with Borin, looking down at the two figures by the stream. Borin grunted, a sound of deep satisfaction. "It seems your gamble paid off, chieftain," he said. Valerius watched his daughter laugh at something the boy said, her posture relaxed and open. He saw not a charge and her companion, not a patient and his keeper, but two young people who had found in each other's quiet strength a bridge across the lonely rivers of their own lives. A new chapter had begun, not just for the orphan from Oakhaven, but for the daughter of Stonefall.